Hello, I'm Dominic Cavendish, theatre critic for the Daily Telegraph. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to find some time to do a Zoom with Simon Godwin, the artistic director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company, Washington. Simon's been well known in directorial circles in the UK for some time, directing classical revivals and new writing with equal aplomb. His successes include work by Harold Pinter, Carol Churchill, Samuel Beckett, Eugene O'Neill. He's been an associate director at the Royal Court and the Bristol Vic, and remains one at the National, but of late he's become particularly well regarded as a Shakespearean director. I'd say his most recent credit was one of his most successful, a Romeo and Juliet captured during lockdown at the National Theatre, starring Jessie, Buckley and Josh O'Connor. I gave that a 5-star rave in the Telegraph, and during the conversation we do talk about that in some detail. A few more credits to throw your way before we kick off the chat. He did deliver a splendid Antony and Cleopatra at the National, starring Ralph Fiennes, and at the RSC produced a commendable Hamlet with Papassiedou, where he also, in fact, directed Catherine Hunter in Timon of Athens, a production that was subsequently restaged at the Shakespeare Theatre Company. I began by asking really quite an obvious question, which was to ask him to reflect on the peculiarity and challenge of being a director with one foot on either side of the Atlantic in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes, I am, as you say, Dominic, based in Washington, D.C. I live just outside the city with my family, my wife and twin daughters, and I've been shuttling between Washington and London. Yes, it's been an incredibly difficult time for everybody, whatever their job, the last year, and for theatres unable to show their shows, to share their work, welcome back audiences, has been really, really difficult. We've had to make staffing cuts at the theatre, which has been tragic, and we've also been doing a lot of work online. There have been pluses. We have been able to reach many more people than we've ever done normally through digital platforms. And indeed, it's amazing to be talking to you today and reaching so many new audiences, even in an interview such as this. And so it's required, I think, from all theatre leaders, a tremendous sense of enterprise and a great sense of hope, a sense that, like Shakespeare, because we know his theatre was closed frequently, down to pandemics, down to the plague, he carried on writing. He wrote arguably some of his best plays while the theatres were closed. When they came back, he was presenting, of course, The Tempest and Cymbeline and Pericles. So I've tried to hang on to that spirit of hope and adventure, and it was thrilling to go back to London and actually manage to get something off the ground in terms of this film of Romeo and Juliet that you described.
We will come to that because I think it's a huge breakthrough, and I'm hoping that maybe it'll have eventually a global audience. You know, it's been something that has been shown on Sky Arts in the UK. I think it's moved to the States, or is about to, and we will follow its progress further forward. But just perhaps before we get stuck into the meat of your Shakespearean career, and I imagine some of these might even flummox you, but I wondered whether you can go cast your mind back to think a little bit about what your earliest memories were concerning Shakespeare and perhaps inspirations. Were you taken as a child to see Shakespeare, and did anything kind of transform your perception of what theatre was about?
Yes, I was taken to the Royal Shakespeare Company as a child. We drove up to Stratford to see some iconic productions. But the thing that really set my heart on Shakespeare was when I was 17, I got to play the part of Hamlet in my school play. And there was something about spending the summer months. I guess I was 16. The summer going into my penultimate year at school, so I was 16 going on 17. And I spent this couple of months listening actually to an audio recording of Kenneth Branagh playing the part on the radio. And for a young man trying to remember these words and figure out what they meant, hearing Kenneth Branagh's voice was enormously inspiring as well as profoundly helpful. Because I think I learned from him about iambic pentameter, about how to make these words feel like they're your own, how to be kind of heightened yet conversational. And so doing the part on stage, I'm sure I wasn't very good, but at least I remembered it. It really planted Shakespeare into my DNA, into my system. And I've been carrying Hamlet ever since I was 17. And it really set me on a quest of how to bring Shakespeare alive, and nurtured in me a love of him from that moment onwards, really.
Well, it's fascinating that you talk there about Kenneth Branagh, who has managed to be the kind of almost exemplary Shakespearean actor of his generation, although there are obviously competitors, and an exquisite director of Shakespeare on stage and screen. And I wondered, actually, that goes to the heart of one question, which is whether you are in an advantageous position if you kind of come at Shakespeare from an actor's point of view, i.e. you understand the kind of challenges and also the pleasures that the text gives an actor, and you therefore give the actor room to find their way through the text, which can be quite demanding, I imagine.
I think that's spot on, Dominic. I mean, I think of the great conductors and how they've always played musical instruments before taking to the podium. And I think for a director, that's right. That's certainly been my experience. And I think the feeling of speaking Shakespeare, of having him in your body, in your system, is a huge help in helping actors. And I think when I worked with Ray Fiennes on Antony, I think the fact that somehow I had a, however distant understanding of what this material feels like to do, probably created an even greater rapport between him and I.
The other thing that I noticed about your early life was that you didn't hound or stalk, but you were certainly totally overwhelmed by Peter Brook, who I suppose is one of the great founding father figures of modern Shakespeare theatre. And is this right? You didn't really get very far in terms of inspiration from him, direct inspiration, but you kind of carried a sort of torch for him. You wanted to work out what he'd achieved. I mean, was he an early template for you, do you think?
I first met Peter when I was 16, and I had sneaked my way into a lecture he was giving for the British Psychoanalytic Society. And I managed to approach him after an extraordinary talk that he gave. And I asked him at that point, because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be an actor, whether I should go to university or drama school. And he said to me with his piercing blue eyes, "My advice to you is not to seek advice from people like me, that you must just go your own way." And in a way, that was something that stayed with me, as you can tell, also from that moment, about his whole emphasis on the idiosyncratic, the personal, about everybody discovering their own pathway, remaking the wheel, as he has done so consistently with his work. I think what I've enjoyed about Peter's texts and his productions that I've seen is that they're extraordinarily clear and they're extraordinarily generous to an audience. He's very curious about the experience of an audience. He's an auteur, but he's an auteur committed to making an experience communicable. He's not interested in obscurity or alienation or distance. He's really interested in a kind of rigorous intellectual collaboration, I think, between those on stage and those watching. So in that respect, he's absolutely been a presence for me. And I was really thrilled to eventually work with Catherine Hunter, Catherine, who's also worked with Peter so much. So that felt like a kind of way of reaching Peter himself.
That's fascinating in a way also, but he is the ultimate exile. I mean, you are in a sense at one step removed now from British theatre by virtue of being in Washington. But his sort of mission, if you will, it's always been to move slightly away, you know, to bring in actors who you wouldn't necessarily associate with commanding roles, different ethnicities, a kind of sense of voyage and humble discovery. And I suppose maybe growing up, looking at the Shakespeare of whether it was the Royal Shakespeare Company or the National Theatre, you might have felt, maybe you did, but there was a sort of tradition that didn't necessarily speak to you. I mean, were there any sort of standout productions as an adolescent or a young man that sort of spoke to you as a potential director?
Yes, I mean, I think that I think Peter has been a great embodiment of putting yourself putting yourself out of your comfort zone, and that being a very creative place to live, to break habits, to confront yourself, to find estrangement as well as familiarity. But going back to your question about productions that really touched me, I mean, I remember seeing, in fact, Michael Crawford, who would later become very famous for playing Phantom, the original Phantom and Phantom of the Opera, in Barnum, of course, a musical about showmanship and the circus. And as a child, I'd loved going to circuses. So I always remember Michael Crawford walking along a tightrope, which he'd learned to do just for that production, and being stunned by the miraculous power of the actor, the magic of the actor. And later on, I saw the great Robert Stevens play King Lear at Stratford in a brilliant production by Adrian Noble, which really showed me something about the passion and the enormity of feeling that you can get from Shakespeare, how he can be almost like the circus, but a circus of the heart. There's something so generous about Shakespeare. And I remember leaving the theatre and crying at the end of it, probably for the first time that I'd cried in a play, and yet seeing Robert Stephens at a peak of his expertise, but terribly elderly, and of course he died soon afterwards, attain this Everest just at the moment when his sort of soul was about to leave the body was terribly moving.
I was going to say that the moment we've been through in the last 3 months, the early part of 2021, has been quite a bleak one for British theatre. Not least, I suppose, because, you know, with national lockdown, it's been pretty hard for any theatre to function properly. And the great redeeming ray of light was the Romeo and Juliet that you managed to capture at the National Theatre. And that's not just me going a little bit crazy in the confines of my dwelling, my lonely dwelling. It is, I think, a major moment and a surprise one, because I suppose there was something quite unexpected about the way this production ended up. It was going to be a proper main stage event at the National Theatre. And then for all those reasons, it turned into a sort of televisual project, but it harnessed the kind of identity and the empty, eerie atmosphere of the National Theatre during lockdown. And I wondered whether, in a way, you could just talk through the sort of the main decision points. What, you know, was there a sort of wake up in the middle of the night moment when you went, let's use that crypt-like Littleton main house as a kind of sepulchre of the mind? You know, well, and it sort of went very quickly, or whether you had to sort of piece it together in a more kind of group committee way than that.
Well, the sepulchre of the mind, Dominic, is a wonderful phrase of yours, and I might steal that if I may. I think that necessity is the mother of all invention, and the obstacle is the way. These were two phrases that we really hung on to. Yes, originally we were going to do it on the Olivier stage. I cast Josh O'Connor and Jessie Buckley to play the two lovers, and we were all set to go. Then, of course, like everybody, the production was cancelled. And it was really through the kind of vision of Rufus Norris, the artistic director of the National, and David Sable, a brilliant producer of stage and screen, who'd really been one of the people who had first thought up the NT Live idea. So the two of them came together, and the two of them came to me and said, look, let's see, can we salvage something of Romeo and Juliet? Can we still do it? And what about the idea of making a film of it in some way? And but what we all felt was we didn't just want to do an NT Live, which was to make a production and film it, but nor did we want to have something so kind of theatrical that it wouldn't really make sense on film. So that sort of came out of our discussion, this idea that maybe by setting it in a abandoned theatre, what might happen is, as the story develops, the imagination might grow, and we might step into a more and more fully realized cinematic universe. But then what became enjoyable and interesting for us to think about is, oh, well, maybe when you're in love with somebody, you move between two realities. You move from a heightened place of almost fantasy, the masked ball we all go to when we fall in love, and this idea of wanting to be totally authentic, totally yourself, totally grounded, the real you. And so the idea then came of going, well, maybe we can actually move between this empty theatre and more fully realized sets, and then from the fully realized set back to the empty space of the rehearsal room, as if to say that this could become a metaphor for what it's actually like to fall in love. And once we started to make those kind of connections, it seemed like this was a concept that was going to have meaning, that wasn't just going to be a sort of pragmatic solution, but actually something that we could really contribute to the play's presence in our lives. And by the way, I'm really hoping that we are able to get it to countries more than America and the UK, so everyone in the world can see it.
I mean, that's fascinating, because I partly assumed that some of the magic of that TV production was only really achieved almost in retrospect. I mean, how naive of me, but actually the editing, the way you were able to cut between, as you say, this very quite a sort of semi-substantial staging back to early vignettes of the actors arriving or larking around, to create this strange sort of disorientating sense of there not being one fixed kind of place, or turning in a way the sort of real into a sort of metaphor for something unreal. I kind of assume that maybe you'd stumbled on that a little bit in edit, but actually you'd conceptualized that quite early on, and you knew that it would work, which is remarkable.
Well, thanks, Dominic. I mean, we didn't necessarily know it would work, but we certainly stumbled on it. So, and that was one of the many risks. But I think at this point that you also make about the kind of the sort of the sense of falling, the sense of what is real. This was also, of course, everybody has been through over the last year, and it was meaningful to also to be able to capture the sense of actually one's reality feels very unstable. And again, going back to the play, we did realize that Juliet's moment when she takes that potion that will, as it were, pretend to kill her, which she will appear to have died from, is a moment in Shakespeare's own writing when he gives that character a sense of disorientation. And indeed in the film, we see her moving between a realized bedroom to the backstage of a theatre, and she sees characters around her. Are they ghosts? Are they fellow actors? And it was another example of this feeling of Shakespeare was also writing a play of disorientation and sort of mental anguish. And it was great to be able to do some of that justice.
Fantastically well put, in a way, creating a sort of unique kind of hybrid between that sort of Brookean aesthetic of what can we live without, but also slightly ambushing the audience to think, oh, it's not just simply a case of, you know, rough and ready, bare minimum theatre. I mean, there are kind of very interesting, quite Netflixy, modern kind of uses of the camera and I suppose the sort of the vocabulary of screenplays. I mean, I suppose I have to ask, you know, you cut and you cut and you cut again. The script, the screenplay would sometimes leave tiny shards left of text, upon which usually, you know, 3 or 4 pages of Shakespearean script were involved. So, I mean, was there quite a lot of agony as you whittled and whittled? And were you surprised actually how much those fragments carried?
Yes, that's an excellent question, Dominic, because I think it relates also to what is a filmic vocabulary, and as opposed to a theatrical one, and also about time. So it seems to me that in the theatre, if you ask an actor to make a cup of tea, essentially it's going to take a certain time. Boil the kettle, put tea bag in, pour water in, pour milk in. Whereas, of course, on the screen, a cup of tea can be done in 2 seconds. I mean, plug in kettle, drink tea, done. So there is generally an intensification, let's say, on screen of time. And it felt like when I was working on the edit and I would send it to film people, they would say to me, oh, there's so much dialogue, so much talking. And at that point I was amazed because, well, read the original, come and see what I'm starting from. I thought I was cutting down tremendously, but every time I did, people would say to me, oh, needs to go a bit quicker. So I think in retrospect, I probably, with Emily Burns, the adapter, we probably went quite far in that direction. And there's probably text that we could have actually, I think, kept in. Having said that, I do think the film succeeds as a very streamlined, inviting welcome into the kind of distillation of the play. And because we only had 17 days to film it, I think it was probably very sensible of us not to take on the full, hey, let's do 2.5 hours of this, because I think we would have needed much longer. And I think the energy that we were working and trying to capture was, in every sense, streamlined. But it was certainly thrilling for me discovering that, yes, even with a line, a word, a gesture, a look, you could do so much. You could do so much talking through an image.
And in a way, does it unleash something in you as a director? I mean, for example, there's a brilliant bit where Romeo is sort of reeling from the shock of having slain Tybalt. There's a sort of kind of moment in the sort of back alley that you created within the sort of behind the safety curtain of the theatre. But then it cuts to Juliet yearning on her bed for this encounter with Romeo, sort of unwitting as to what really lies ahead for her. And you couldn't, I mean, maybe you could do that in the theatre, but it felt much more somehow dynamic, and also speaking to the fact that maybe Shakespeare himself would have loved those tools, would have loved to be able to jump back and forth, but those conventions didn't entirely fit in his day. Did you feel something new was being discovered there about what you could do? Because it was still theatre, and yet you'd created this sort of film jump cut.
Yes, absolutely, Dominic. Well, I mean, I think the filmmaker Derek Jarman would have agreed with you. And I think Derek Jarman, we found a quote when we were working on the film from him saying Shakespeare would have loved cinema. And I can't help feeling that's true, that Shakespeare was already, in a way, writing amazing screenplays, and his love of spectacle and intense stories and amazing characters. And also this point that Shakespeare does, which is to write in flash forwards into the language, we realized as we were doing it. So that starts with the prologue in Romeo and Juliet, where the whole story is laid out in the first few minutes of the play. And then there's an amazing moment when Romeo is about to go to the party where he'll meet Juliet. And he says to his friend Mercutio, I had a dream last night. And Mercutio kind of mocks him taking the dream so seriously. But then Romeo says, and in the dream, I ended up going to this party and it leading to my death. And so there are these jump cuts in Shakespeare's writing that we were able to bring and somehow embody and bring to life. But your point about will that change the practice of my directing on the stage? I think for all of us as we go back into the theatre, and I imagine it'll be fascinating, Dominic, because you'll be seeing more plays than any of us, how much do directors try and engage with the new digital language that we've all been forced to embrace when we go back to the stage? And that might be something as in a way simple as just be aiming for a greater sense of the montage in the theatre, which I know people have always, in some level, explored. But for me as a director, it's about how can we make theatre even punchier, even, dare I say, less linear, so that the sense of an audience is audiences are surprised again by Shakespeare. And I think the best productions of Shakespeare are when the audiences are surprised by them, rather than seeing what they expect.
I mean, one coup, and it might have been my overinterpretation or misreading of what you'd achieved, was the sense that because you created this constant bleed between backstage and onstage, well, there being this strange middle space that was neither fully, closed off or fully open, that the sorts of flirtations that would happen in a rehearsal room between actors, or just the basic bonding, became, without any real definite line, the sort of seed points for the romance that we see flowering in the play. And I don't know that, I'm not sure, well, obviously that must have been part of the intention, I guess, but whether that is a completely unique tool that you had with the camera work, and whether you could really ever suggest that on stage. I mean, it felt as though somehow something was elevated and discovered there that you would not find in a normal production of Romeo and Juliet.
Yes, I think you're also exactly raising a question about authenticity and the stage. And it's very complicated because we've all seen productions that have begun, for example, with the actors limbering up or doing their exercises in their rehearsal clothes. And it's very difficult to make those moments feel anything other than phony, because the director has sort of sculpted everyone to look like they're preparing, and it's actually all part of the illusion. Whereas the cinema, you do have that documentary feel of being able to capture a look, an exchange that is sort of off the cuff, that is spontaneous, maybe only has ever happened once, but you've caught it. So I think for theatre, it'll be very interesting how we go back to the idea of representing reality, authenticity, illusion, dreams, stylization. And I don't know where it will lead us, but it will be fascinating, I think, to track those questions.
And you say there that it's a documentary, which it is, bizarrely, of the entire, it's a kind of time capsule of the National in its lockdown. So that particular moment, and future generations will probably have to be told about this, the idea of somebody kissing, the idea of somebody touching, carried huge charge. And I suppose, again, it's a weird, perverse boon of the pandemic that you get a Romeo and Juliet, which comes with all the strange frissons that would have been there for those archetypes, but really hasn't been with us since time remembered. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? That you do get a sense of sex and sensuality and touch and everything to do with the skin being perilous.
Well, absolutely, Dominic. Absolutely. I mean, it was remarkable doing it, as I remember it now with you today, thinking how touch could have killed somebody. I mean, that's the situation we were in. No one was vaccinated. We were only doing this through regular testing and living in bubbles, and trying our very best. But yes, the touch was the one thing that we couldn't do in normal life to each other, even with people that we were very close to. So the idea of of this couple's love being forbidden was very charged. And even just rehearsing the scenes in masks and socially distanced, and then having a moment, a window just after the COVID test when they would say, go, and you could tear the mask off and hold and hug and touch each other in these scenes. It gave them an amazing charge, as you say. And I think looking back on it, I think there will be a whole category of art, the kind of COVID art, the things that were created during this pandemic, and they will hold some very deep imprint of the trauma that we've been through and the ways that we tried to find to deal with it.
It is interesting how from another time, a lot of work that even quite recently I was writing about now feels, I mean, there is such a shift. There will be so many changes, but in a way emblematic of the sort of great high point of the Rufus Norris regime at the National, not long after he took over, was your Antony and Cleopatra, which had, a kind of almost an MGM quality of immensity and opulence about it. And, speaking to Rufus Norris, it seems as though in terms of budget and ethos, those times are not going to come back soon. So I just wonder whether you can revisit very quickly that production, because it was, again, interestingly, a little bit like a moment of film meets theatre, because Ralph Fiennes brings with him this sort of meta quality of being a screen star. And there was something quite, as I say, sort of cinematic a little bit about the attempts to create luxury on stage, a swimming pool, a sort of movable submarine. I mean, did you just think, let's go for it at that point? And that's not knowing, of course, that in a way that would be a bit of a last hurrah for the massive set.
Totally, Dominic. I mean, all these things now have a kind of eerie poignancy to them in a way, as we recall our life before. Exactly, that was a high kind of watermark in a way of the National Theatre's commitment to delivering the most spectacular shows within the classical canon that you could find anywhere in the world, I would argue. I mean, the resources the National had then were extraordinary. And so for me as a director, being able to take a play that is as cinematic and grandiose, indeed is about grandiosity, that is Antony and Cleopatra, was an amazing opportunity to realize that play at a level of finesse and finish and spectacle that I could do nowhere else. And indeed in Sophie Okonedo and Ralph Fiennes have the actors too, who could deliver that scale. And I'm so happy that I got the chance to do it, and I'm happy that it's recorded on NT Live. So it was an amazing opportunity to realize that play, which is in itself about grandiosity, hyperbole. And so to give a hyperbolic production of a play so much about hyperbole was a great privilege for me. And those moments are gone for now, and a new language is being asked of us. And I hope, in a way, as artists, we can keep being grateful for the chance and also grateful for the demand to keep redefining our vocabulary.
We now need to turn. I could easily spend hours on each of these productions, but we must turn immediately, really, to your new status. You have gone elsewhere, much as we would have loved you to stay in the UK, but you have gone productively to Washington to run the Shakespeare Theatre Company just ahead of the pandemic, which I guess thereby hangs a tale. Do you want to just give a tiny potted history? Because I suppose it is fascinating. There is this huge, obviously, connection and affection for Shakespeare in the States, and there, kind of at the seat of governmental power, sits a theatre that is committed to putting on Shakespeare. But I guess the Shakespeare's Globe in London is very well known. How well known should Shakespeare Theatre Company be? I mean, is it comparable, do you think, in a way, or maybe not?
Well, there's a bigger question about Shakespeare in America, Dominic, which maybe we'll speak about in the next few minutes. But as by way of introduction, the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington was founded by a director called Michael Kahn over 30 years ago. He founded it and he ran it for, I think, in total 33 years. So incredible tenure. And he built that theatre up. There are two large buildings now in the center of Washington that constitute the theatre. And I had been aware of Michael's work as I was doing Shakespeare in England. And then when I directed Hamlet for the Royal Shakespeare Company with Papa Seydoux playing the part, my production, in fact, came to Washington. And it was a very nice coincidence that they were looking for a new artistic director, and they reached out to me about potentially applying. And I said, well, funnily enough, my Hamlet's going to be in your city in a few weeks. Why don't you pop over and see it? I'll be there too, and we can talk. And I really enjoyed my conversations with them, and I really enjoyed the seriousness with which Shakespeare was taken here in the capital city of America, and the sort of commitment from the political community and from the legal community, as well as it were, through the general audience, to come and see these plays and really think about what they might mean, and not just for the personal, but also for the political. So in that sense, the context seemed very exciting. I think there's a question that I'm sure, Dominic, we'll be talking about Shakespeare and what he means in the world now, and the sort of, dare I say, the conversation, or indeed the battle about who's Shakespeare and what's Shakespeare for, and what does Shakespeare symbolize. And of course, I'm now in the heart of all of those conversations, but I'm excited to be in the heart of them. And I think Washington is a place of course, of debate more than anything. So putting on Shakespeare's great debate plays in the center of debate feels exciting.
Fascinating. I mean, in a way, you couldn't have asked if you were writing a diary, you couldn't have asked for a more interesting period of time to be in a new country, as it were. I mean, in a way, we've all watched, or the world has watched, not very long ago, the kind of storming of the Capitol. We've seen this kind of transition of power from one president reluctantly to another, and in the midst of that, something that might almost have stepped from the pages of, from Julius Caesar. Did you feel as though there was, whether it's Richard III or Julius Caesar, or all those power plays, that suddenly you were somehow in the middle of them in a kind of contemporary setting, perhaps? There's some strange kind of elision between these two worlds.
Totally. I mean, I think, Dominic, the elision you describe is a very Shakespearean feeling. And I think it's a testament to Shakespeare's genius, that how often we feel those moments of, my God, this could be a Shakespeare play. I had that very strongly with the little-known Timon of Athens, which I had just remounted for Washington, in fact, closed when the pandemic struck. And this is a play, of course, that's about somebody going from a place of enormous wealth to self-isolating in a cave. And it's also a play in which a revolutionary force almost brings down the Senate. Ideas when we were rehearsing the play that we were struggling with ever being believable. And then, of course, to close the play, to retreat to our own caves, and then get to a place whereby the capital of the United States was under siege from armed protesters, did feel like an extraordinary moment of Shakespearean prophecy coming true. So yes, that's why his plays are so amazing, I think.
And is there a sense, in a way, that, I mean, it is hard, I guess, to talk about two complex and different cultures, but just as it were, crash landing into this new world, with many decades of work behind you, did you immediately start to sense, as it were, a kind of what it is domestically that maybe that city, and also America generally, is looking to get from Shakespeare that might be different, just starkly different to our own appetites in the UK? I mean, was there a sense of adjusting to that set of needs, or in a way, I suppose, perhaps you were required and wanted to bring materials and ideas and tastes from the UK? It's an interesting kind of meeting point, but I guess you had to kind of work out initially what you were landing into.
Absolutely, Dominic. And of course, I only had 6 months running the theatre before the shutdown came. So I would say that the phase you're describing is something I'm still very much going through, which is, I think theatre is tribal. And I think when you grow up in a city or a country, without even thinking about it, you become attuned to what's funny, what's shocking, what's surprising, what's resonant. And it's not until you leave that country that you go, oh my goodness, I've got so much shorthand with the country that I grew up in that I don't have in the country that I'm now in. So you almost have to go on a crash course of going, right, what's funny here? What's shocking here? What's going to be surprising here? One of the things I have noticed actually is how people say to me, oh, I imagine in America, they're a lot more free about how to approach the text and edits and cuts. Actually, the opposite is true. I think that there's nothing as freeing in a way as being in your own culture, exploring and playing with a cultural object from that culture. I think when you're in a country where you're dealing with a playwright that's not your own, there is a sort of care and reverence around him. So some of my sort of capriciousness, or my sort of willingness to be rather, I don't know, flamboyantly naughty about the text, is something that I need to kind of in a way, bring America behind me on. That is, it's okay to cut Shakespeare. It's okay to rearrange Shakespeare. It's okay to have upside down Shakespeare. That sometimes you're doing Shakespeare more justice that way than you are just by serving him traditionally.
I suppose huge question, which is no one interview can really do justice to, but I suppose that there must be a greater emphasis or attention, particularly now, but probably prior, to questions about race and racial identity in America than maybe, although again, things shift every minute in the UK, but that it's an interesting moment for you to arrive as a white British director, but with this incredible calling card, which is the first Hamlet at the RSC with a black actor, which is quite shocking as well as impressive. I mean, it feels as though some of these moments, these landmark moments, are long overdue. But in a sense, are you sort of, is there a big difference in terms of discussions about how to present race in Shakespeare in the US? I mean, particularly at the moment. I mean, do you think that is maybe one of the biggest changes that you've encountered, or maybe not?
Yes, I think that I think every country and city has its own nuance, but what I think is the same in Britain and in America is the feeling that Shakespeare needs to belong to everybody, that he is a writer, if he's going to survive, that needs to feel reflective and responsive to everybody in the community, and to not be the preserve of any one faction, if you like. And I think the greatness of Shakespeare is that we don't know what he thought about anything. I mean, he didn't write a diary. He didn't, or if he did, he made sure it wasn't around when he died. There are no letters from Shakespeare. And I wonder whether he was very cleverly, even then, taking himself out of the picture and foregrounding his characters that were locked in a series of extraordinary arguments and contradictions and antitheses. And it's that debate, that set of opposites that his plays have that I think makes them so valuable, that they can't be taken over by one group or another. They are simply sites of discussion. And I think sites of discussion are more valuable now than ever. And I think that's, for me, why his plays speak so importantly to today in America and to England.
It's an interesting kind of stepping out of your comfort zone for any director to go and run a building, let alone run a building in another country. And just in a way to continue this, it doesn't have to go on particularly long, but I mean, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, nobody really talked very often about white privilege. And I wonder whether, in a way, there is something one could say that almost to be gained from the particular attention that is given now to why a director is allowed to do something, who that director is. There is quite a lot of heat, I suppose, on power and who wields it. And I don't know whether there are sort of two sides to this, which is that it can be quite challenging. You may feel a sense of, I don't know, of imposter syndrome, but also there is a valuable scrutiny going on at the moment.
Yes, valuable scrutiny feels right, Dominic. And I think that for better, yeah, I mean, my approach to theatre making has always been collaborative, has always been, I hope, something that's engaged a wide variety of voices. And I've always tried not to be the kind of sort of bossy auteur in the middle of it all, and more just a kind of lightning rod for ideas and thoughts. And I think for me, coming to America has been also looking at the other artists that I can employ and work with, who are going to bring understanding and perspectives that I don't have by my own socioeconomic background. And I think appointing Whitney White, who's a brilliant female African-American director, and bring her into the team, and Soyika Colbert, who's a wonderful academic who's written a lot about Lorraine Hansberry, to also for me to help me understand not only Shakespeare differently, but also crucially the classical canon in America. What are the plays that have been overlooked wrongly, which now need to be seen? And I think bringing the Amen Corner to our theatre, which we did just before the lockdown, was really significant, because this is a play by James Baldwin, hadn't been seen in Washington since the 1950s. I knew it was a great play. We put it on, and the response was terrific. And that's, I think, us doing our job, which is, as I say, expanding the canon for a much wider audience.
It is interesting that your Shakespeare work often does have a thrill at other places. I mean, it's not. It's. I think I'm right in saying this, that it's not white, boxy, and British. It's often quite leaning towards other climes. So I suppose, obviously Antony and Cleopatra has that quality. Timon, you kind of embraced, I suppose, the Greek heritage of Catherine Hunter, and in a way with Hamlet, interestingly, it was kind of transposed to a kind of nominal African state. And interestingly, again, there you used the actor, your central character, Hamlet Papasedu, to slightly steer your directorial vision, I think. That's right. I mean, maybe you could just unpack that a bit, because it seemed to be quite interesting as a way of resolving some of these issues with your own particular lens, and saying that your job is to facilitate perhaps the unearthing of new voices and also different kind of colonial and cultural antecedents.
Yes, absolutely. I think you've described it very well, Dominic. The sense that for me, the director as facilitator, having a conversation which begins absolutely with the actors that I've cast, because I feel like it is a partnership between me and them, whether it's Papa, whether it's Rafe, whether it's Joshua Connor, whether it's Jessie Buckley, Sophie Okonedo. And I remember Sophie Okonedo saying to me when I asked her, who was Cleopatra for you? Who is Cleopatra for you, Sophie? She said, oh, I think the nearest person I can think of is Beyonce. And I was like, okay, great, exciting. I wouldn't have thought of Beyonce. And how wonderful that you did. So it then to then travel forwards to the actual production. Sophie ends up wearing a dress that was directly inspired by a Beyonce outfit in one of Beyonce's videos. So I am always very hungry for these associations. And I think that they're very thrilling to get out of my own box and into a shared space with others. And so that becomes a kind of genuine partnership, that is the heart of all my productions. And so the casting becomes critical, and that central collaboration is deeply formative.
There are in your productions as well these almost taken for granted gender flips or realignments, and in some ways the 12th night that you did at the National I saw as the sort of moment, the turning point in British theatre really in the last 10 years, because although there obviously had been very notable cases of gender blind casting and gender flipped casting, as it were, reassigning the character to another sex. This seemed to be on a main stage at the National. Malvolio, always played really traditionally by a man, was given to a leading kind of comedy actress, Tamsin Greig, and from then on it felt as though there wasn't really going to be much going back. And I just wondered how much is that now permanent? I mean, I can speculate that is, but in a sense, do you think that we have crossed this bridge, and that bridge is now kind of crossed? You can't really go back to the old assortment of roles.
Yeah, I think so, Dominic. I mean, I remember when we did in the preparation for 12th Night and working with Tamsin on the idea of playing it, we did read the play with Tamsin just reading the text as Malvolio, with the pronouns referring to Lord Malvolio, to a man. And I think Tamsin and I just felt it didn't really make a lot of sense, because Tamsin said, well, I don't really understand who am I? I mean, man, woman, and so then we took this, what seemed at the time, I must say, very bold step of going, well, let's read it again, but let's change the pronouns and let's change your name to Malvolia. And we read it again with a company of actors, and suddenly it all made sense, because everyone was just very clear that this was a woman, and Tamsin felt she could play her as a woman. And it was liberating. And I think it was a change, a little change to the language, but with very big consequences. And I think very liberating ones, because we could just see this play, which needed refreshing. I mean, this was a play that had been done the same way, as it were, in the casting for 400 years. So I felt we were being true to the spirit of Shakespeare, even though we were adjusting the letter of Shakespeare. And to your question about, does this now mean, has a Rubicon been crossed? Will this now always be the case? I don't think Malvolio will always be played by a woman, but I think what's brilliant is that there will always now be a sense of possibility, that anybody can play any part in Shakespeare. And sometimes that will work brilliantly, and sometimes it won't. But what's thrilling is the sense that I think Shakespeare thanks us when we take bold risks, and when one's committed to a sense of making him for our time and for everybody.
I mean, it is often said that Shakespeare is the great enabler of flipped casting. After all, you only have to go and look at his own period and see that he was writing female parts that he knew would be played by boys. But I suppose there are these interesting tensions, aren't there? Because I know that I think one of your plans for the theatre in Washington is to do the history cycle, or some of the history plays. And I guess we look at different Shakespeare plays for different things. We might look at Twelfth Night as a kind of dark, dreamy fantasy. Likewise, Romeo and Juliet, I can imagine played in all kinds of ways. But when I suppose you've got Henry V, and Henry V has been played by actresses in the UK, but there is this sort of perhaps a slightly more resistance from an audience, but possibly, who want there to be an acknowledgement that these events on stage do correspond to some kind of historical actuality. And we know Shakespeare played fast and loose with history, but he wasn't. He was making points about probably status, hierarchy, and also gender relations in those periods, perhaps. And I wonder, is there a danger that our interest in, as it were, wresting some of those roles out of the traditional hands of men and giving them out could possibly unbalance them, or make the representation questions dominate the particular themes and discussions going on in the plays? I mean, there's not an easy answer to that, but whatever your thoughts are, would be grateful to know.
Yes, I think that, look, I mean, I think as a director, you never want your concept to stand in the way of the play. You want it to release something new in the play, rather than obstructing something in the play. So the proof is in the pudding, as it were. And I think all the great bold choices from Peter Brook sitting with Midsummer Night's Dream in a white box with trapezes, through to, I believe, Michelle Terry playing Henry V at Regent's Park recently. All these gestures are meaningful because they work. Because in this case, Michelle Terry was a terrific actor of whatever gender, was able to bring something out of Henry V in an entirely new way. And I think that's what you're searching for, to serve the plays better, not worse, through making the choices that you do. I think this question, though, of seeing Shakespeare as a historically faithful writer is probably a red herring, in that I think he was playing fast and loose with a lot of that historical material. I mean, his intention was to create a really thrilling show for his audience in the globe, and he was drawn to these stories not because I think he was out of a historical faithfulness, but because he thought they would make really good plots for the Hollywood of the time, which was situated at the Globe Theatre. So I think if we see him as showman, as we see him as a kind of flamboyant entertainer, then it takes the pressure off us, I think, to sort of contain ourselves or confine ourselves in one agenda or another. I think if I do the histories in Washington, my primary job will be to make the history plays sing and speak and be thrilling and contemporary to that particular audience. And I would, of course, treat the plays differently in Washington than I would do in London or in Stratford. But that's, I think, our job as director, is to find the form that makes the plays speak to that particular community.
I suppose in a way, part of that question about, how do you judge the balance? How do you make sure that you're speaking to the needs of the acting community and the audiences and honouring the play? They're sort of bubbling away in an interesting form at the moment. And people, partly because I suppose of the advent of and the advancement of social media, people are swifter than ever perhaps to point out issues that they find problematic. And there's even been a sense, particularly in America, and I may be speaking out of turn, particularly in America, that the very position of Shakespeare as a kind of cultural icon, as a figurehead of the literary tradition, is within question now. And it may be too far to say that people are calling for the cancellation of Shakespeare, but certainly some might suggest that would be appropriate given some of the material that he presides over. And also there have been clearly examples of his work being removed from some syllabuses. Jonathan Bate, the Shakespeare scholar, said he thought the future of Shakespearean theatre was more uncertain than it was before. A little warning bell, I suppose, a little alarm bell. Do you think there's going to be a sort of contest, a kind of culture wars contest over Shakespeare in the coming decade or so, just because of what he represents and what has been made to represent? Sorry, that's another long question.
No, excellent. And I think what he has been made to represent is probably a very germane part of that question, Dominic, in that, I mean, Shakespeare, by his nature, the fact that Shakespeare as a writer is, as it were, incomplete in a very meaningful and conscious way, means that his plays will always be available to be reflective of the times that they are being staged within. Having said all of that, of course, historically, we know that after Shakespeare died, soon afterwards, the Puritans came and closed down the theatre entirely. So Shakespeare has always been at the center of, as it were, culture wars. He's always been in the middle of the battles of what should be on our stages. He's of course outlived all those battles. I mean, he's traditionally had the last laugh, 400 years. He's I think feeling pretty good, and I'm sure whatever struggles that we pass through, he'll remain for 400 more years. That's not to say that we have to be sensitive to how we stage Shakespeare, and have to, I think, engage with these questions and produce, as the phrase is, the anti-racist Shakespeare, which is just about catching ourselves. What are the agendas that we're unconsciously almost replicating, and how do we become aware of that and sensitive to that? And I think that these are all really good and healthy questions. And I think if we as directors and as critics actually ask them thoughtfully and fairly and judiciously, Shakespeare will continue to thrive. And by the way, on the social media question, Dominic, I don't want to sound sort of obsequious, but actually I think the rise in social media has actually meant the role of the critic has become more important than ever. I think more than ever, we need a small group of writers, critics, that are going to help pilot audiences and artists actually through this period. And I think I'm very excited about that. And as I do more and more plays, and I think it's clear in our conversation today, the critic becomes more and more of a partner to me, a critic who can, of course, there are going to be times when the critic does not enjoy your work and holds you to account, but somehow that the space over a long period to be in dialogue with a partner, an audience, a witness, a critic is very interesting and helpful. So I think there might be a new understanding of the importance of these central relationships as we move forward.
That's interesting. It does feel as though there have to be public conversations a bit like this one as a kind of continual strand in and around the work. Otherwise, people may just retreat to, as it were, the kind of knee-jerk response or disengage, which would be fatal. I mean, there has always been, as long as I can remember, questions about whether Merchant of Venice should be staged, whether Taming of the Shrew deserves its place in the repertoire. You, I think, are heading towards the Merchant of Venice. Perhaps in sort of wrapping up, you could just indicate, and we've only done a few steps really around your tenure, but indicate what you hope to be doing, and whether in some senses those kind of firing line plays, they're going to be put on stage. They need to be put on stage. Whether you think there are plays that have served their time and now should be put on the shelf pretty much permanently.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, so long as human beings behave badly, which I fear they probably always will be, the plays of Shakespeare describing people behaving badly are probably pretty necessary. I think we would be in a place of real head in the sand by banishing all plays which deal with the struggle for justice or prejudice or violence or a kind of profound unkindness, because these are all things that people pass through sadly in life. And I think Shakespeare is a very crucial space for us to understand why those things happen, and also the consequences of violence and hostility. So I think they become critically humane spaces for us to, as a group, come together. And I think particularly in Washington, where of course the political divide is very stark, how do we get different members of Congress coming into a room together, people with very different political opinions, and converging and being able to, as you say, discuss and talk about really hard issues in a safe way? That, I think, theatre has a really important part to play in. And the Merchant of Venice, absolutely. I think we have to accept there are challenges in the writing and really look at the production, going back to casting again, the director, and find a way that that play can speak meaningfully and usefully to our time, rather than unwittingly or wittingly consolidate opinions that are themselves deplorable.
In the last few minutes, one thing that is worth mentioning, I think, is Shakespeare's comedy. And Shakespeare does still miraculously make us laugh, although sometimes he, unsurprisingly, makes us just furrow our brows and wonder what on earth the gag was. I mean, is there, in some ways, rather than worrying about Shakespeare being cancelled, as some people do, is there just a more general worry that some of the language, some of the references, and just the entire ethos of some of those, particularly the comedies, may ebb faster than we expect. I mean, there is a sort of a kind of feeling in some circles that restoration comedy is a little bit passé at the moment, and I just wonder whether there have to be fighters for not just the greats like Hamlet, but actually those plays like Two Gentlemen of Verona that you've brilliantly staged in the past. They could slip out of our grasp quite fast.
Yeah, totally, Dominic. I mean, I think the comedy. Look, I mean, in the film of Romeo and Juliet, I hope people will get the chance today to see it. That I have cut a lot of the bawdy humour from that, and I think that's perhaps largely to do with I didn't really understand the bawdy humour, because I think Shakespeare was writing for his time, and comedy does date. I'm sure the comedy being written today will, on the whole, not be viewed in 400 years' time, because we just won't understand the shorthand of these comic gestures. Having said that, I'm also in this season going to do Much Ado About Nothing, which I've set in a Washington newsroom, with Beatrice and Benedict being warring co-hosts of a news program. And I think that's given us great access, at least working on the script, to the public-private, to representation, and to this context in which we're very familiar with kind of warring broadcast news co-anchors. There's a sort of chemistry to those relationships that's also ripe for comedy. So I think it's also about finding landscapes, contexts, worlds in which these plays can meaningfully be funny, and finding actors that can bring that language to life. It's not easy at all. And I think, as I said, we've spoken a lot today. I think Shakespeare needs to be cut. He always has been cut. He was cut in the Elizabethan age. He needs to be cut today. And it's how we do those cuts that will determine whether a production succeeds or fails.
Well, on that very resonant word, cut, I feel that we have actually hit the mark almost of the hour. Thank you so much, Simon Godwin, for finding time to talk about so many facets of the Shakespearean world, many more things to explore. And I imagine we shall hear, hopefully, from Washington very soon, when the world gets back to normal. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for such a great conversation, Dominic.